Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. It's very nice to see you all here. This event on basic income and racial justice is part of a series of events that the Stanford Basic Income Lab has organized on the topic of universal basic income. And the lab was established in February 2017 to provide some rigorous research and in-depth discussions to support the growing interest in basic income. So we had an event on basic income experiments. We had one on the political philosophy of basic income. We had another event on gender equity and basic income. And so if you're interested in all of those, they are all recorded and the videos are on our website. basicincome.stanford.edu. And you can also sign up for our mailing list if you go on the website. My name is Juliana Bidadanure. I am an assistant professor in the philosophy department here. And I'm also the faculty director of the Basic Income Lab. And I will be the moderator for today's discussion. So tonight we are very excited to welcome Mia Birdsong and Dorian Warren for a discussion on how basic income ties into the ongoing struggle for racial equity in the United States. MLK famously defended guaranteed income in his book, Chaos or Community, Where Do We Go From Here, in 1967. And the Black Panther Party had guaranteed income as part of their 10 points platform in 1966. So tonight we will discuss together whether 50 years later, basic income still seems relevant to the struggle for racial justice in this country. This event is organized in partnership with the McCoy Center for Ethics and Society, the Center for Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity, also based at Stanford, and the San Francisco-based Universal Basic Income, Universal Income Project, sorry. So let me say a couple of things about our two speakers before they start. So the first will be Dorian Warren. He has written a particularly important piece titled Universal Basic Income and Black Communities in the US, which you can download on the Movement for Black Lives website on the part of the economic justice part of the manifesto under reparations. Dorian is president of the Center for Community Change Action and vice president of the Center for Community Change. He's also a fellow at the Roosevelt Institute and co-chair of the Economic Security Project, a collaborative fund that was started over a year ago to support universal basic income research and advocacy. He previously taught at the University of Chicago and Columbia University, where he was co-director of the program on labor law and policy. He also worked at MSNBC, where he was, among other things, host and executive producer of the show Nerding Out. He currently serves on several boards, including Working Partnerships USA, the Workers Lab, and the National Employment Law Project. And he's also co-author of The Hidden Rules of Race, Barriers to an Inclusive Economy, that was published with Cambridge University Press, and co-editor of Race and American Political Development. So that's Dorian, and he's going to be our first speaker. Our second speaker is Mia Birdsong. Mia is co-director of Family Story, an organization that works on shifting the conversation about families today in the US. Their mission is to create a more equitable nation by supporting America's diversity of families around issues linked to poverty, housing, health, workplace, immigration. Before that, Mia was already working on families as the vice president of the Family Independence Initiative, an organization that leverages the power of data and stories to illuminate and accelerate the initiative low-income families take to improve their lives. Mia has given a TED Talk called The Story We Tell About Poverty Isn't True in 2015, which had over 1.5 million views and which I recommend very much. She's also a senior fellow at the Economic Security Project, where she's expanding the current universal basic income movement to include perspectives from communities experiencing economic and racial injustice. She has recently started a listening first tour to hear what communities of color and economically marginalized families throughout the US have to say about universal basic income. And she's going to talk about that today. So the format will be that our speakers will each give a 15-minute talk, and I will then spend 30 minutes asking them questions, and then there will be time for questions from the audience. Okay, so please join me in welcoming our two wonderful speakers, and Dorian, you can come to the podium.
Good evening. We could try again, a little better, right? Good evening. Good evening. There we go. Okay, do we need coffee in here? So it's really an honor to be here. I want to first thank Juliana for this invitation, and congratulations on the Basic Income Lab here, and also thank Joni for making it possible and the rest of the staff for us to be here. And a special hello to two former colleagues and old friends, political scientist Margaret Levy, who's in the audience, and Melissa Michelson, who's also in the audience. Thanks for coming. It's also an honor to be here with Mia to have this conversation, and Juliana has promised she will ask us very difficult questions, so stay tuned. So yesterday, we celebrated the life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on what would have been, I think, his 89th birthday. And this year, 2018, we commemorate the 50th anniversary of his death by an assassin's bullet on April 4th, and it's worth remembering that Dr. King was assassinated in 1968, of course, supporting striking sanitation workers, demanding a living wage, safe working conditions, and the right to engage in collective action. And of course, it's worth remembering it would, of course, be another 15 years before the legislation was won to create the federal holiday, almost 20 years before it was first commemorated. And there's so much to talk about, especially within the last 5 days of the politics of this country, that I imagine Dr. King would be rolling over in his grave right now. But I want to focus on where he was and his strategy towards the end of his life. So part of going to Memphis was part of him organizing the Poor People's Campaign and the encampment in Washington to bring attention to poor people. And of course, towards the end of his life, he was focused on the triple evils of poverty, racism, and militarism. And so that's where he was ending up, and I want to come back to that. But of course, we're here to talk about UBI, Universal Basic Income or Guaranteed Income. And so for those of you in the audience who maybe are supportive of the idea, it's gotten a lot of buzz in the last couple of years. I just want to say, welcome 50 years later to the party, because this is not a new idea. And in fact, Dr. King had somewhat landed on it at the end of his life, as had the Black Panther Party. I'm going to come back to that. Part of my tech friends who are engaged around this idea come at it from a position of a concern about technology today and how it could be disruptive, whether it's artificial intelligence or the robots, and what impacts they might have on the labor market. But I like to point out that this was also a concern of Dr. King and the civil rights movement. And in fact, one of Dr. King's lieutenants, Bayard Rustin, who organized the 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Income, was actually obsessed about this question of technology and its impact on Black workers. Rustin organized, with A. Philip Randolph and some others, the 63 March on Washington in August, and in October of 63, he wrote an essay reflecting on that march and its impact and importance. And he wrote, "The civil rights movement alone cannot provide jobs for all. It cannot solve the problems raised by automation. And automation deprives more Negroes of jobs than any other single factor, including prejudice. Under automation, we are faced with a new Civil War situation all over again." It's quite a line. Once again, the union cannot endure only half free. It can't survive if it is divided into those who receive high incomes and those who are unemployed. So, 63, October, Rustin is worried about automation. And in fact, what we now know in hindsight is that it was in some ways prophetic because what ended up happening was deindustrialization, partly due to automation, but it especially affected African American workers who, as a result of one of the biggest gains of the civil rights movement, the 1964 Civil Rights Act, got access to industrial jobs for the first time in the moment when we decided, or not we, I should say, when Capitol decided it wanted to flee northern cities for the South, and then, of course, outside of our borders for cheaper labor. So this question of technological disruption, in this case of automation, that's also an old question that civil rights movement organizers and thinkers were really, really concerned about. Dr. King wrote, of course, Chaos or Community, Where Do We Go From Here in 1967. He also gave a lecture almost 50 years to the day, well, not to the day he was assassinated. April 14th, I think it was, 1967, he gave a lecture here at Stanford where he came out in favor of a guaranteed income. But I want to read a few passages from his book, Chaos or Community, about his position on guaranteed income. There's only one general proposal that I would like to examine here because it deals with the abolition of poverty within this nation and leads logically to my final discussion of poverty on an international scale, he writes. In the treatment of poverty nationally, one fact stands out. There are twice as many white poor as Negro poor in the United States. Therefore, I will not dwell on the experiences of poverty that derive from racial discrimination. I will discuss the poverty that affects white and Negro alike. I'm now convinced, he continues, that the simplest approach will prove to be the most effective. The solution to poverty is to abolish it directly by a now widely discussed measure, the guaranteed income. He continues on, earlier in this century, and it's almost like he was writing these words now, earlier in the century, this proposal would have been greeted with ridicule and denunciation as destructive of initiative and responsibility. At that time, economic status was considered the measure of the individual's ability and talents. In the simplistic thinking of that day, the absence of worldly goods indicated a want of industrial habits and moral fiber. Boy, that sounds familiar. I could have sworn we just decided as a country we were going to include work requirements into Medicaid last week. We're still having this argument. He writes, we have come a long way in our understanding of human motivation and of the blind operation of our economic system. Now we realize that dislocations in the market operation of our economy and the prevalence of discrimination thrust people to idleness and bind them into constant or frequent unemployment against their will. The poor are often less dismissed from our conscience today by being branded as inferior and incompetent. We also never know that no matter how dynamically the economy develops and expands, it does not eliminate all poverty. Final two paragraphs. The proposal is not a civil rights program. In the sense that the term is currently used, the program will benefit all the poor, including 2/3 of them who are white. Interesting what he's doing there rhetorically, by the way. I hope that both Negro and white will act in coalition to effect this change because their combined strength will be necessary to overcome the fierce opposition we must realistically anticipate. Then finally, to pay for this, he gets his dig in at the then controversial war in Vietnam, of which he also came out against that year. John Kenneth Galbraith has estimated that $20 billion a year would affect a guaranteed income, which he describes as not much more than we will spend the next fiscal year to rescue freedom and democracy and religious liberty as these are defined by experts in Vietnam. So he's counterposing how much we're spending in the war economy to what we could be spending domestically to eliminate absolute poverty. So some passages from Chaos or Community. And many of us see, myself included, UBI or guaranteed income as one of several elements in a reimagined 21st century social contract that provides economic security and freedom for all. But we get there through different political and strategic routes. Futurists and technologists come to the basic income idea via technology and automation. Libertarians come to basic income from arguments around efficiency and reducing the size of the state. Progressives come to basic income from a concern around non-domination, freedom, and redistributive justice. And I come to this question from a Black political tradition with a focus on race and political economy. It's the tradition that led both Dr. King and the Black Panther Party to argue for both full employment and a guaranteed income 50 years ago. So of course, number 2 of the Black Panther Party 10-point platform in October 1966, we believe that the federal government is responsible and obligated to give every man employment or a guaranteed income. Same with Dr. King, essentially in his final book, he is arguing for both guaranteed jobs, full employment, and a guaranteed income. So I like to say to my friends who I debate all the time, who are on the jobs guarantee side of this, that I don't see them as mutually exclusive. And in fact, whether you're for guaranteed jobs or guaranteed income, nobody has the political power to win right now. So how about we build a movement, and I will go with either one, if we could build that movement to actually win one or the other. Both the Black Panther Party and Dr. King hoped that guaranteed income, guaranteed jobs would be won for African Americans, but also all Americans. And I think 5 decades later, it's time that the rest of us caught up to their vision. Black workers today face the exact same dual crisis 50 years ago of high unemployment and low-wage work. The Black unemployment rate is twice that of white workers at nearly every level of education. And when Black workers can find work, it's usually in the crappiest, lowest paid jobs. Thus, one need not be only concerned with future trends to speculate that a basic income would help Black Americans today. We just have to look around to Black communities that are continually left out and locked out of the current labor market, especially those that have a criminal record. Now, historically, seemingly universal social policies, from the New Deal to the Great Society, have often had the sometimes intended, often unintended effects of maintaining or exacerbating vast racial or gender inequalities. Many supposedly universal policies that we passed, whether in the New Deal or Great Society, were not ultimately universal. They excluded some folks. We know the story of President Franklin Roosevelt, who compromised on his New Deal programs because Southern Democrats insisted on it. We still, to this day, have race-based occupational exclusions of agricultural and domestic workers that were first, by the way, included in the Social Security Act. We fixed that, but we didn't fix the National Labor Relations Act or the Fair Labor Standards Act, the minimum wage, which still, to this day, have those occupational exclusions demanded by Southern Democrats to exclude Black workers initially. But advocates for a truly universal social policy did not give up. They eventually won racial inclusion and Social Security, and they are fighting to this day. There's an incredible domestic workers movement in this country to fix those occupational exclusions, those racial and gendered exclusions. Much like those advocates who have continued to fight for a more inclusive social contract, today we shouldn't limit our political imaginations about the promise of a guaranteed income because of the very perilous questions around race or immigration or exclusion. And quite the opposite. We should imagine a robust basic income that advances racial and gender justice while addressing the ills of 21st century capitalism. Now, I have argued that a basic income in all but a few forms would actually benefit African American communities for a few reasons. First, it would provide an individual sustaining basic floor, especially for returning citizens caught up in the criminal justice system who cannot find work. Second, basic income in many ways would disproportionately benefit Black Americans. African Americans' disadvantaged position in our political economy is the result of the accumulation of centuries of exploiting Black bodies. If you think of the sweep of American history, say from 1607 to the present, the first 25 decades was a system of racial slavery, first 25 decades. The next 10 decades, basically from the end of Reconstruction to 1965, was a system of Jim Crow. And it's only been 5 decades since we've been approximating a democracy in terms of our racial caste system. So when you add up all those decades, especially the first 25 and the next 10, it's clear to me Black Americans either help build the co-owned wealth of our nation from infrastructure and banking and legal and patent systems, or denied access to our share of it. So a basic income would, for justice reasons, help repair the exploitation and expropriation of Black labor over several decades, many, many decades. Third, a basic income will be an improvement on today's current social safety net. On my day job, I fight every single day to protect the current safety net. Medicaid is the fight right now. Food stamps will be here in about 3 weeks. That fight will go on all year long. Nonetheless, some benefits, like SNAP or food stamps, are replete with paternalistic restrictions that rest on racist and sexist tropes about recipients and their consumption habits or their work habits. Others, such as the Earned Income Tax Credit, which a lot of us love, are significantly tied to work, which is problematic when structural racism continues to create barriers to Black employment. So a basic income would solve some of these flaws of our current social safety net. I argue that we should think about basic income, because of the racial history of this country, in a different way for Black Americans. So I wrote a proposal called UBI Plus. So basically it's a prorated amount for Black Americans of a UBI over a specified period of time. It draws on this idea of targeted universalism in designing social policies. Such a proposal would take into account the historical and cumulative disadvantages of income and wealth and inheritance afflicting Black communities. It would effectively function as reparations in a grand bargain with white America. All would benefit, but those who suffered through slavery and continuing racism in the economy would benefit slightly more. Well, let me put it a different way. Just for fun, I decided to take the 2 most unpopular ideas in American politics and put them together. A few last words, and I should just say that proposal did make it into the Movement for Black Lives policy platform in August of 2016. The way I pay for the extra amount, by the way, is taking all the money that we divest from mass incarceration and putting it into this extra prorated amount. Okay, so let me end with the words of Dr. King himself. I want to give you 2 different quotes. This is from that lecture he gave here at Stanford in 1967. It was called The Other America. And he said, now one of the answers, it seems to me, is a guaranteed annual income, a guaranteed minimum income for all people and for all families of our country. It seems to me that the civil rights movement must now begin to organize for the guaranteed annual income, begin to organize people all over our country and mobilize forces so that we can bring to the attention of our nation this need. And this is something which I believe will go a long, long way toward dealing with the Negro's economic problem and the economic problem which many other poor people confront in our nation. To end with another passage from Chaos or Community, this is, I think, my favorite one. He writes, "The curse of poverty has no justification in our age. It is socially as cruel and blind as the practice of cannibalism at the dawn of civilization, when men ate each other because they had not yet learned to take food from the soil or to consume the abundant animal life around them. The time has come for us to civilize ourselves by the total, direct, and immediate abolition of poverty." If that's not moral clarity, I don't know what is. And I think we should take those words to heart and take this old idea to heart in a new time and fight for a guaranteed minimum income and guaranteed jobs. Thank you very much.
So, hello. I remember the first time that I heard about basic income. I was in a Black Studies class in college, and what I remember more than the discussion we had was my immediate reaction to the idea. And I was totally dismissive. Not just because I thought it was unlikely, but because there was a place in me that had a moral objection to it. Free money, as I thought about it then, went against everything that I'd been taught by America about how to be a respectable citizen. I was taught that my value as a human being was tied to my ability to produce through paid labor, that my dignity was earned through hard work. And hard work was not the challenging effort of personal transformation or even how engaged or focused I was on the act of labor. It was about sacrifice. It was about sacrificing time with loved ones, sleep, safety, well-being for the job. And as someone who was poor, grew up poor, and is Black and female, I was taught that I had a very long and hard path toward proving that I was deserving, because the standard was defined by wealth and whiteness and maleness. Believing that paid labor is what gives one's life value is not unusual. Research from the Insight Center for Community Economics and Economic Development shows that across racial and ethnic lines, the belief that having a job is moral and confers personhood is deeply held. Confers personhood. People believe that you're not actually a complete person unless you have a job at which you're earning money. This shouldn't actually surprise us. The American dream mythology is built on notions of bootstrapping and independence and the nobility of sacrificial hard work. And the formula we are given for achieving the American dream is that hard work equals success. So these formulations, job equals personhood and hard work equals success, conspire to create a narrative about deserving versus undeserving people. If you are middle or upper income, you're kind of born deserving. But if you're poor, there's a martyred exceptionalism that's required for you to qualify as deserving. So this framing allows those of us who make it to believe that we deserve our success and that any wealth we have has been earned. It leaves out inherited privilege and luck that actually distinguishes the haves from the have-nots. And there are softer and kinder versions of this narrative for all of the more progressive people among us, but that othering that happens along the whole political spectrum is the same. Poor people are seen as slightly different breed of human being than the rest of us. Given this fundamental belief in the interconnection between paid labor and worthiness, it's easy to understand why our national approach to addressing economic injustice focuses on changing people who are poor instead of changing systems that perpetuate economic injustice, or frankly, focusing on the behaviors of people who accumulate absurd amounts of wealth. It's easy to understand why our current safety net system is rife with paternalism and rests on assumptions of irresponsibility and shiftlessness and makes accessing benefits a hazing process that requires superfluous hoop jumping and egregious invasions of privacy. It's easy to understand why we keep returning to the idea of work requirements for the people at the bottom of the income wealth scale to receive benefits, while those of us at the top can receive benefits without any requirement, other than having money already. Now, since that college class that I took, I've had a couple of decades of political education, I understand that guaranteed income is not a crazy idea, but it is one of the right steps toward achieving justice in America. While our current system requires benefit recipients to prove that they are worthy of basic human rights, like housing and food, guaranteed income begins to address economic justice in simple terms. It emphasizes agency with its focus on giving unconditional cash with no strings attached directly to people. I see in it reflected the values of social trust and generosity and self-determination. And I see in that an ideology that can guide our reimagining of the entire social contract with America. So as this conversation about guaranteed income has churned in the tech sector and in think tanks and in spaces like this one, I am really, really excited about what UBI could mean for economic justice in America, particularly for Black and Indigenous communities. I also know that it will fail miserably without the wisdom, insight, and leadership of the people who would be most impacted by it. And that's why I launched the Listen First Tour. So this is basically, I go around the country, I talk to groups of people who experience economic injustice, and I tell them about UBI, and I find out, what do they think of the idea? What would they want it to look like? What else needs to be included in it? And there are two things I hope to accomplish by this. One is to lift up some of the wisdom and insight from the folks who live in poor communities and bring it back to the places where people are having this conversation today. And remind the people who are having this conversation today that Black folks who are disproportionately targeted by economic injustice have, as Dorian said, been at this work for a minute. The second thing I'm hoping I do is spark interest among people who are doing economic justice work to include universal basic income in the work they're doing. So I've worked in the cash transfer field, if that can be a field, for more than a decade. And the clarity that people who are poor share with me about the power of cash has never changed. Access to flexible dollars is more helpful and efficient and gives people a greater sense of control and agency in their lives than most of the programs and policies and services that we have tried over the last 50 years to use to eradicate poverty. In talking with people specifically about basic income, the responses are pretty consistent. People really like the idea. When I ask people what kind of impact it would have on their lives, responses are wide-ranging but fall into some very obvious categories that I think all of us can relate to. I will say that a focus on the impact that it would have on people's children is definitely one of the through lines that I hear. So what comes up? Education comes up. Families would love to be able to spend money on tutoring their kids. They would love to be able to reward their children for trying really hard in school. They would love to be able to save for college. Housing is a dream for everybody. They want more space for their kids. They would like their children to each have their own bedrooms. They want a yard, they want a porch where they can have a barbecue, and they want more privacy and agency over their space. They want a place to belong, to create safety and groundedness. People don't just want housing, they want homes. Another thing that comes up a lot is vacation and travel. We have this idea, as Dorian was saying to me earlier today, that poor people can't have leisure time. And sometimes it was about being able to travel in the cities that they lived in, take their kids to museums or on field trips, and sometimes it was going to cities outside of where they lived. Many folks talked about wanting to take their kids places so that they could see the world outside their immediate surroundings. There are also things that come up. I mean, many of those are things that upper and middle class people don't have to consider, but there are some things that were particularly striking to me, like people talked about using basic income to make sure they had a functioning car, or always have gas in their car so they could consistently get to work or get their kids to school. One woman told me that she would, if basic income was a reality, she would let her son try out for football because she'd know she'd be able to afford the uniform. The other thing that folks have made clear to me about UBI is that thinking about it outside the context of reforming the safety net system doesn't make sense because the safety net system is deeply, deeply flawed. This is the big thing that I think is missing from the current universal basic income conversation. Childcare and housing came up all the time as systems that really need to be, are in need of improvement. And this is not anything that is new. There have been tons of studies and kind of media investigations about what's wrong with housing and what's wrong with childcare in America, but perhaps it bears repeating. Childcare is too expensive. It doesn't meet the standards of quality that parents have, and I will say that those standards are often very different from the standards that the state sets. Parents individually have their own requirements, go figure. And it isn't flexible enough for the kinds of work that people have. And if you have a kid who has special needs, it's kind of a next level nightmare trying to find childcare. Housing, as those of you who live in the Bay Area know, is too damn expensive and extremely limited. Applying the kind of underlying ideology of basic income to housing might mean getting rid of a rent-based system and shifting to one that is about ownership, so that people who are paying rent for public housing, which people do when they have public housing, they're actually building wealth. It's going toward a mortgage as opposed to going toward rent. So this is like a handful of the things that I've heard from folks as I've been doing this tour and as I've talked to people about guaranteed income across the country. So I support it as an essential piece of economic justice because one shouldn't have to earn dignity. Each one of us, simply because we exist, should have access to the things we need to live a life of well-being. And as the wealthiest nation in the world, we have no excuse for not ensuring this for every one of the residents in our country. But we are facing this pivotal moment with this radical idea, given the increasing coverage and interest. And if we're strategic about building power, the movement for guaranteed income can reflect the priorities and needs of poor people. If we fail, guaranteed income runs the risk of solving for a technocratic utopia instead of the lived realities of people today. It's time for those of us who have the most at stake in this movement to lead it. Thank you.
Thank you so much to both of you. Is this working? Yes, great. That was very interesting and very powerful, and I'm sure that there will be many questions in the audience, so I'm going to try to keep my questions to a minimum. And so I guess I want to start with a question for both of you on work. So you've both have been very careful in your talks to start from a place that you share, I think, a place where we see the dignity in work and where people need to be recognized as contributors in societies in order to lead meaningful lives. And this is something that if we don't start by acknowledging this when we talk about universal basic income, we can get very far away from what we all value as a society. And you've both kept that at the center of your perspective. So there is really a concern, especially coming from unions, that accepting basic income is not just compatible with the broader strategy, a broader strategy to improve work from the inside or to improve jobs from the inside, but it really goes with the strategy of giving up on jobs. And it's potentially another strategy to disorganize labor. So there is this very dystopian world where you would imagine more and more unemployment, where people are living on benefits that enable them to lead a life of basic subsistence, but without real meaning, without opportunity to contribute. So I guess I want to hear you two more on how you see the struggle for basic income tying in and fitting in within a broader struggle for meaning and for dignity. And whether, so Dorian, you said something about the struggle for the job guarantees being compatible with that for basic income. But I guess I want to hear you more on how you can articulate those two together, both strategically and as a matter of principle. Because it was striking to me and interesting to me to see that the Black Panther Party was proposing guaranteed employment or guaranteed income. And that was one point in their manifestos. They were really seeing those two as tied together. So I want to hear you two more on this topic.
Oh, the easy question first. Thanks a lot.
Welcome.
Okay, so, so can I go
No,
first?
go ahead.
Okay.
Yes. You got this.
Oh, this is in some ways one of my favorite questions because there's so much to say. Okay, so first on just in terms of the relationship of guaranteed or basic income and the labor movement, organized labor. I come out of the labor movement in many ways, and it is not the magic bullet to solve all of the problems of income inequality and the ills of capitalism. It's just not. There are a set of testable hypotheses about what a basic income might do in terms of worker power. And a colleague, Brescian Rogers at Temple Law School, has written really wonderfully about this, about thinking of universal basic income not as the magic bullet, but we need a range of other kinds of policy reforms that give workers power. Basic income is not necessarily that. But here are the testable hypotheses. One is, if you raise the income floor, one testable hypothesis is that it actually gives unions a higher floor from which to bargain. So actually, we've seen this in the case of minimum wage and debates about the minimum wage historically, right? There was a fear like, oh my God, if you end child labor, the economy will collapse. Or if you create a minimum wage, it's going to kill the labor movement. Actually, the higher minimum wage creates a higher floor for unions to bargain from, first. Secondly, there is a real testable hypothesis about if individual workers had a guaranteed or basic income, would that increase their individual bargaining power, right? So would they be able to reject a crappy job if they knew that they had enough on which to survive? And then would that lead to the creation of jobs that advance the social good instead of jobs that don't? Like, so we don't know right now, but these are testable hypotheses. Third, we actually do have some real-world experiments, not just in other countries, but also in the US. So if you look at, there's the Alaskan oil dividend, but then there is also a study of the Eastern Band of Cherokee, I believe, who got a casino and then gave every member of the tribe the equivalent of a basic income. And so there was a question about, would people stop working? Because that's a big concern. People stop working. Actually, no, that's not what ended up happening. People didn't stop working. And in some of the studies, both in Alaska and with the Eastern Band of Cherokee, people actually picked up more part-time work. So it's kind of the opposite of what you might expect. And then there are a range of other outcomes, like higher educational outcomes for children, better health outcomes, in the places where we've approximated an experiment of a basic income. So there are all these external benefits besides the hypotheses around work that we might imagine. Last but not least, I mean, I think you have both said this in terms of this notion that we have to earn dignity through work. And in the sweep of human history, the Protestant work ethic is a really recent invention. And we have to remember that. And I think our task at hand, which is a deep cultural task, is to de-link work from worthiness. And it's not going to happen tomorrow or next year or in 10 years. But I do think we tend to not allow poor people to have leisure. It's like they don't earn that, but the president can go golfing on MLK Day. We're good with that, right? So there's like this different set of expectations around leisure. And I think we have to redefine the relationship of work and leisure in the current and future economy. And in some ways, like maybe I'm going really, really far here now, but like, why isn't leisure a fundamental human right? Mm-hmm. Like, can we imagine that? God forbid. So we have to, I think, really get at the deep cultural notion, because the last thing I'll say is, for the critics who say, well, you know, you're going to create work disincentives and people need to work, those are all the people that have good jobs. that usually say that. They have meaningful work. And then when you raise the question of, well, what about the crappy jobs that's not meaningful work? No one has a good answer. Well, that's what people have to do to get to the good jobs. So there's usually no answer to the modern division of labor between those that have good jobs, which we might call task definers, who define work for other people, and then task executors, right, who have to do the stuff that other people determine. So there's a whole, I mean, that's just the surface of a whole, in a deep conversation we have to have, I think, in this country, in this world, about the nature of work today and in the future, how work should or should not be defining of people's humanity, and then how do we want to reorganize work to make work and jobs, not the same thing exactly, work for the common good in a world which, especially of all the challenges, including might not have a world in 20, 30, 50 years. Like, how can we even have the deep conversation about the nature of work and how we should reorganize our jobs and our economy?
I'll just add a couple of things. So one thing this makes me think of is the question of what gives our lives meaning, right? And I think most of us, if we kind of sit and think about that, the things that give our lives meaning are community, family, contributing, right? But that contribution doesn't have to come through paid labor. And I think for, most low-income people, it doesn't, because they have the crap jobs. So, I'm sure there are a few, super zen McDonald's workers who really do find meaning in making cheeseburgers, but those people are exceptional, and exceptions should not be our standard. Most of us are going to find that boring and fairly meaningless. So I think the idea that people's contribution is going to come through paid work is generally absurd. And I think it also devalues the things that actually make our lives good and give us lives of well-being, which is about family, community, health, holding other people up. The other thing it brings up for me, I've totally forgotten, so I'm gonna just not say that.
I'll come back to
it. I'll remember later.
Perfect. I'll move on to the second question then, which is really about so one of the driving reasons that seems to justify universal basic income is the fact that existing benefit systems and systems of public assistance are very punitive. They are punitive in various ways. They are punitive because those systems are designed to deter recipients from applying to get those benefits. And they are punitive because it's very stigmatized to be on benefits. And I come from basic income. I came to basic income from a very European perspective, growing up in France and then living in England, where we share some of the same realities around public assistance and the benefit systems than in the US, and whereby being on benefits is heavily stigmatized, so much that the take-up rates for those benefits is very low. So people sometimes can't claim those benefits because it's too complicated to get to that point. And sometimes they could get there, but they'd rather not be a benefit scrounger. They'd rather not be seen as a benefit scrounger or a welfare queen. So what I found very interesting in the discussion we just had is that in the US, it seems to be particularly a system of stigma that's filled with racial tropes, as you said. And gender tropes. And so I wanted to hear you both on those tropes and how they motivate, in particular, your commitment to basic income in the US, and how you see it in a way as welfare reform and as a very required welfare reform.
I mean, when welfare started in the United States, it was, for white women who were widows. And, as Dorian kind of talked about, as the system was built, it was designed to exclude Black folks. It was designed to exclude Black women in particular. And as the face of welfare, as the face of poverty became Black, and Black families, Black people are overrepresented in media representation of poverty in America. I mean, I think Trump said the other day that he did not realize that most people who were on welfare were not Black, which I should not find astonishing. So as the face of poverty became Black, the way that benefits were designed became more punitive, became more shaming, became more hoop jumpy. And that exists both in terms of how the policies are structured, but it's also just in terms of the implementation, because the cultural narrative that exists around policy, people who are processing people's applications for food stamps or housing are also seeing these narratives. So that those stereotypes are kind of built into the system, both from a cultural perspective and from a policy perspective. One of the things that I talk to folks all the time about what their experience of being poor is, and I think there keep being these things that surprise me, because I think most of us don't know how food stamps or public housing or whatever work. So I was in Jackson, Mississippi earlier this year talking to a group of women who live in public housing. And they were talking to me about the policies that exist around when the owners of the place can kind of come into your home, right? So most places, if you rent an apartment, there are some laws about, when your landlord can enter your home. If you live in public housing, those don't exist. People can do inspections whenever they feel like it. So, in the middle of the night, theoretically, people would have people come in to find out whether or not there was like a man in their house. If you're somebody who complains about the fact that your refrigerator is broken, or your doors aren't locking properly, your windows aren't locking properly, all of a sudden the inspections that happen, the surprise inspections that happen in your home increase. So they're basically living as inmates in a space that they're supposed to be making their home and raising their children. And so that's both like built into the policy, but it's also built into the implementation of the policy.
The only thing I'd add, because you're just on a roll asking easy questions, thank you for that. Two quick things. I think when we think about the punitiveness of welfare states and social safety nets, I think it is largely a question. It's two things. One, it's just a question of redistribution. First of all, and how we choose to redistribute certain benefits from the state. So we think very differently about, say, the mortgage interest deduction than we do food stamps. Don't know why. We think differently about tax cuts. We just had a huge debate that some of us lost about tax cuts, which is essentially redistribution upwards, than compared to redistribution downwards. It's related to the second point, and that is you can't get around this question of punitiveness without the question of race and otherness. You just can't. Whether in this country, and there's an entire social science literature on this, why do Americans hate welfare? You can imagine similar titles. And it comes down to, if you look like me, then I think you deserve it. If you don't look like me, you don't deserve it. And it's not only the case in this country, I'm grossly oversimplifying, but it's not only the case in this country, this is across rich democracies. Some economists have studied this. Countries that are more racially homogeneous have more generous welfare states. So it's fundamentally a question about belonging in political community. People are willing to be more generous in terms of redistribution to those that look like them. So any solution has to deal with that question head on, whether it's race, nationality, religion. But in the US context, it's been bound up with race and often gender. And so we have to have a strategy in this country to really to transform the racial politics of our current welfare state. And this is really important in terms of the discussion around guaranteed income. We have to be creative and figure out some strategies to not make this a program that people see as others, but actually enlarge in the circle of belonging so that we can create a winning coalition to win the thing.
Great. So one last difficult question, and then I promised that end was an easy one. And this one follows from this. It's really on universalism. And so what I find really interesting in what you both said is that you are both concerned about the exclusion, the systematic exclusion of Black communities from wealth accumulation, and from the labor market. And you're also interested and driven by the devaluation of women's work in the past. And this is really something that's at the center of your interest. And yet the solution that we are here to discuss today is the solution of a universal basic income. And I guess I want to hear you more on this. And you had the concept of targeted universalism as well. Is this a strategic move in a way? You know, we have to move towards universal solutions because we are in such a divided society that reparations, for example, stand very little chance. But then I don't think that's what you think, because you also have the UBI plus proposal. Or is it more like a principle that you believe in universalism for various reasons, and you think that this is the way forward in general, not just maybe for benefits and public assistance, but also for childcare, also for housing? So I guess I want to hear more on the universal part of the...
Let me just be very clear. I am super down for the redistribution of wealth. I am fine with rich people not getting universal, like not getting basic income. And I am absolutely down for giving Black people more. So to be clear, how we frame that, what that looks like, whether it looks like, you know, UBI plus, or it looks like more like a reparations framework that we apply to lots of things. It could be applied to the job market, it could be applied to housing, it could be applied to lots of systems that we exist in. I'm less specific about, but that's mostly because I'm not an implementer. I don't look at tax code, I'm not a policy person. I'm like, here's an idea, and then somebody else should figure out what that looks like. But I'm not attached to the universality in terms of class. Absolutely, I feel like the things that America has done to Black people, the things that America has done specifically to Black women and Indigenous women, don't just affect us, they affect anybody who's proximate to us. So we've built this massive prison system that disproportionately impacts people of color, but there are a hell of a lot of white people who are in prison. We have an economic system that disproportionately targets people of color and makes us poor, but most poor people in this country are white. So I feel like when we center the people who are most impacted by an oppression or discrimination or some issue, what we will, if we help those people get out of whatever that thing is, it's going to help all of us. So I'm not trying to like cordon off basic income for people of color, but I know that if we make sure that that system works for people of color, that the white folks who also experience poverty are also going to be fine.
Yeah, so there's two things here I would add to that. So one level of discussion is around values. And so one of my values is equity and racial justice. And so if you start from that place, it leads you to say, if everybody got a UBI tomorrow, we would still have a huge racial wealth gap problem. And so from a position of equity, to be able to talk about, well, what would it look like to undo the racial harms of the past over many decades, and to, with the value of equity, to really tackle the racial wealth gap. That's where the UBI plus, the proposal comes from. But that's at the discussion. That's in the realm of values around equity and justice. There's another conversation about political strategy, and I don't want to conflate the two, and that's the age-old challenge we've had, whether it's the labor question, the race question in this country for over 100 years, is the strategy question. How do you build a winning coalition around any targeted policy, and especially a policy seen as benefiting racialized others? Now, on some level, all policy is targeted. Even things we call universal is targeted. Like, we call Social Security universal, but it's really targeted at old people, right? It's targeted towards the elderly for a reason. Or, I don't know, tax cuts, it's actually really targeted to the 1%, but the arguments publicly are about how it's going to benefit everybody. And most of us know it's a sham. But anyway, so we have these debates, right? Almost all policies are actually targeted in some ways, but part of the craft of politics is to make the argument that they're somehow universal to craft a winning political coalition. So I don't want to conflate the two things. There's like, what's the policy design to deal with the values questions around equity and justice? And then that's related, but distinct from the question of political strategy. Well, then how do you frame the policy or the issue? And how do you create a winning coalition based on different kinds of frames or political rhetoric to win a particular policy that is most likely targeted towards a group of people?
Okay, very last question, and very short one. So I want to ask you, so you first, Mia, if you were to say what you take to be the biggest challenge to the growing of guaranteed income based on your discussions with families throughout the country, and Dorian, based on your organizing and your work, what would it be, the kind of the biggest obstacle at present?
I think that we as a public have been socialized to dream small. And, you know, the idea of basic income still seems like outrageous, I think, to most folks. What I say to people is I think about, you know, my enslaved ancestors in, like, I don't know, the 1700s, right? When before them, all they'd known was generations and generations of enslavement, and they didn't ever live to see slavery end. And I think about how glad I am that those of them who were fighting to end slavery weren't like, ending slavery, that's too big. We should just make it less shitty. Like, we should just make it like better to be a slave, so it's not such a bad experience. And I'm like, thank God they were like, no, this is like, we need to get rid of this thing entirely. So when I think about basic income, and I think about not just basic income, but like the idea that that the ideology under basic income is what we should use to rewrite the entire safety net system. That's what I think about. I'm like, maybe this isn't gonna happen in my lifetime. It hasn't existed before me, and I might never live to see that, but I'm not going to dream small for my children or my children's children or their children.
So much.
Just to think, at some point, all those slaves who worked hard earned their citizenship by working. That was a joke, sorry. It was a bad joke.
I got it.
Bad joke.
I laughed.
Bad joke. It kind of took a civil war, right? Any notion that you're going to work your way to citizenship didn't quite work out. You know, the challenge is, as a country, we hate poor people of color and immigrants, especially in this moment. We just do. And so for me, it comes down to a question of power, political power. We have to organize and build movements to actually make this democracy real. You know, from one perspective, it's like if you think about American democracy, we weren't really a democracy in 1776, we weren't a democracy in 1787. If you just do a measure of democratic principles, free and fair elections, freedom of speech, a range of things, arguably, you know, we had a racial caste system until 1965, so that might be the first moment we became a true democracy. But then, of course, we had backlash to that. So we're still working on this democratic project. And embedded in it, right, has always been, we don't like others. Like, we don't value women. We don't really like people darker. We don't like immigrants. We're having that debate right now. And I think, at least from my perspective, it has always taken strong social movements. And let me just pause by saying, you know, a lot of kids in school just read the I Have a Dream speech yesterday, I hope. And all the discussion, we always forget about the first half of that speech. We just go to the flowery, like, oh, you know, hand in hand. No, the first half of that speech is a searing indictment of this country. that still applies today, about how all the ways, right, that this is not a democracy and democracy has failed, Black Americans in particular. So I'd encourage you to read the first half of the I Have a Dream speech if you haven't. So this has been a long project. I mean, we've always had to create a kind of politics outside of normal institutions to create transformative changes in rare moments to move this country towards true democracy and justice. And so I think whether it's UBI or some, right, the bigger existential crisis that we're facing right now, I think that's the task at hand. What are the movements that are going to create a transformative critical juncture for us as in this moment, but going forward? We have an amazing amount of challenges ahead of us as well. So I think it's about organizing, it's about power, it's about creating the political will to actually, once again, transform this country in a fundamental and systematic way where we can truly be proud of what the United States of America is supposed to represent.
Thank you so much. So we have about 20 minutes for questions from the audience. So I think there are microphones that are soon to be circulated. So if you raise your hand, I will point them towards you. So Deborah here, and then we have a question there, and then Guillermo there.
Thanks. This was great, and I think you both did a wonderful job, in particular addressing a worry I have, but I'm going to push the worry. Yep. So you put basic income into a context where it wasn't a standalone solution. You haven't talked about the level also, which of course is very important when you think about it as a standalone solution. So Milton Friedman had proposed replacing all welfare programs in the United States with one, negative income tax. Now I agree that's a problem because it privileges work, but I think there are a lot of problems with a one-shot payment to people. A lot of the things that people need are collective goods like schools and decent housing and security and control over what's the direction technology takes. And I really worry about the politics of focusing on, it's a kind of American idea, and I support a guaranteed income, but it's a kind of American idea, give everybody a little bit, right? And then you don't have to think about the structures, right? Or who owns things, or who's making the decisions. Now, I agree you can sometimes empower people. That's why the level is important. If the level's pretty low for a basic income, and it's not going to be that high realistically, you're going to have a lot of inequality. You're going to have a lot of people flooding into the market, buying better schools, buying better housing, unless you can figure out collective goods. And I worry in America, as opposed to Europe, the way this is going to play is people are going to think, I got a one-shot obligation here, right? I'm going to, everybody's going to get a check, and then it's not my problem anymore.
I mean, I think we can hold more than one thing. I'm clear that advocating for basic income does not mean I'm not advocating for other things. And I think the folks that I've been talking to have made it clear that, like I said, they're like, yes, UBI, and it's insufficient. So I think that which is part of why I want them to hear from actual poor people. But I also think that the fear of oh my God, if we argue for this one thing, we're not going to have these other things, isn't a reason to not argue for the thing, right? And as I said, I believe we can actually hold more than one idea at the same time and talk about, we want universal basic income and we want these other things. And that's what I mean when I say we need to actually think about how we dream bigger. And not feel like asking for basic income is so massive that we can only focus all our energies on that as a solution to economic injustice in this country, and not believe that we can be we want to have this thing and a whole bunch of other stuff too. Because I absolutely agree with you. Obviously, UBI doesn't solve for schools, it doesn't solve for housing, it doesn't solve for a lot of things. And we're not trying to say that it does. And I think that more of us need to stop accepting the kind of fear-based argument that if we argue for this one thing, that we can't have the other stuff too. We can have all the things.
It's a really good question. It's a real conundrum that we have to be creative to figure out, well, what's our answer to that? So we could use your help on this, thinking through this too. One interesting thing to me, just like going back and reading in the 50s and 60s, and there's a libertarian strain that points to Milton Friedman, and for some people on the left, that's like really scary. It's like actually when Friedman is arguing around this idea of a negative income tax or basic income, he's actually doing it on our terrain because we were winning the battle of ideas then. So it's not a coincidence Nixon introduced it. We were, right, liberalism of a New Deal kind was actually the dominant discourse, not neoliberalism, which is where we are now, right? Or we're transitioning to something else. So it's just worth remembering, like, what was the context in which a Milton Friedman is making this argument? They lost the battle of ideas after the Great Depression, right? We were ascendant, some of us, right, from a particular, so that's just like a reminder. I agree with Mia. I do think there's, clearly like the campaigns to end child labor didn't deal with the issue of giving workers the right to organize, right? So we do have to be expansive, I think, about what is the package and the big vision. What's the menu of big North Star ideas about how do we want to organize our economies and our democracy today and tomorrow? And this is, I think, a piece. And I think this is something we can experiment with now. And in fact, the train has already left the station. Stockton is doing an experiment. There's some other experiments that have happened. So can we actually be smart in this moment and actually be honest about those experiments and find out what really happens? We give people cash. I would say we give people what the minimum wage is now, $12,000 a year. We can argue about the details and how we pay for it and all that, but that would be the minimum baseline. And we'd end absolute poverty, like that, on how we measure it, which, by the way, was the goal of the War on Poverty. When LBJ announced the War on Poverty, he said we were going to eliminate absolute poverty. He announced it in 1964. We were going to eliminate absolute poverty by the bicentennial of 1976. When have you heard any policymaker be that bold or ambitious recently? That was the goal. That was the North Star. We were going to do that. So I actually want to figure out how do we reclaim that spirit. At the same time, where like my job is to build the movement to win something, and in exchange, right, with hearing from those most affected, and doing some policy experiments. This is the beauty, in some ways, of a certain kind of federalism where we try out things, right? That's how we tried out ending child labor when people said the sky would fall if children didn't work, God forbid. We tried the minimum wage, right? Massachusetts first, some other states before we scaled up at a key moment in the 30s when we had the power to, right? So I think in the meantime, we could be doing these experiments and learning a lot about what else we need. What are the wraparound policies to a UBI that are actually going to empower people economically? But really hard question, and it is a conundrum.
We'll take two questions at a time, maybe. Okay. One here, and then Guillermo.
Thank you for your fascinating thinking and panel on UBI vis-a-vis racial oppression. I'm curious, Mia and Dorian and Juliana, where you see opportunity in kind of an international solidarity moment for universal basic income, maybe from your country's perspectives as well, France, for example, and whether the focus that you have on sort of reversing racial oppression might be used to facilitate this international solidarity opportunity, and logistically even. What's the universal beyond the United States? Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah.
Is this on? This is less of a question, more of a comment. I'm super invigorated by this. Thank you. My name is Agatha, and I work for an organization called Democracy Earth, and we're working on a blockchain-based faith-based technology to enable liquid democracy and UBI by dripping cryptocurrency to people over time just for being alive. And it's all open source. We published a white paper that anyone can read and contribute to on the website democracy.earth. And we're also looking for ambassadors. You all seem perfect and would love to collaborate. And I'm so happy and hope there's more UBI believers out there.
Should we get one more
We'll
question?
take a question, Guillermo's question, and then. So one more question, yeah.
From the standpoint of building support and advocacy for this, where do you see the faith-based community coming into play, and not just Christianity, but Judaism, Islam, and so on, when we've got just the Abrahamic faiths all have, this is a basic tenet, is bringing people out of poverty, supporting the poor, et cetera. Thank you.
That's great. Maybe I'll start with a response to international solidarity. So I really see, so initially I think when I moved to the US, I was struck by how different the debate on basic income was here than it was there. Because there it was really seen as a further enhancement of the welfare state. And it was really seen as a really automation-based a solution to technological unemployment, at least when the debate was growing 2 years ago. Now I'm much more optimistic about the possibility to create connections between basic income movements throughout the world, because I see more and more similarities. And I think especially around the need to move away from a very punitive system of public assistance that makes those who have to claim benefits very stigmatized and very weakened by the system. So I think they are. I'm not sure that that there is just one line that aligns all those movements. I think there are many different important conversations we need to have about work and the centrality of jobs in our existence, and that are happening in different contexts. And I think that makes the movement quite interesting. And just on the faith question, there is actually an interfaith coalition in Canada that's very active in the movement for basic income. So that's one example. But I think you're right that there are potentially more and more groups that are going to get towards basic income soon. But I'll get you to say something about that.
The faith question is interesting to me. I would love to see faith communities move away from work that is about charity and toward work that is about justice. And I realize there's a wide range there. Like, there are lots of faith-based folks who are doing work around justice. But I think that broader question is that in many communities, religious communities, there is an attraction to the idea of charity. And I think we need to do some examination of what that means in terms of how people think about power. And I mean, I feel like there's a lot of kind of rich, certainly theology around thinking about power and thinking about what it means to actually create equitable societies through the tenets of people's faith. But I would love to see this shift from charity to justice.
I think the international question, I totally agree with that on faith. I mean, I think we're in the midst of one of the greatest challenges of our time. The sense of not just the US, but Western democracies really being confronted with racialized and religious others. And so we see one response to it as right-wing populism and white nationalist populism in particular. So that's a huge barrier, right, to any notion of, as we've discussed all evening, right, providing some kind of fundamental benefit or right to everybody. You add on top of that, we're on the precipice probably of the greatest mass migrations in the history of the planet because of climate change and conflicts around the world. And most people who will be moving around the world are not white, right? So it's a challenge. So I'm gonna point to there's the UBI organizers corner over there. So Jim and Sandhya and Kara, and I can't see who else is over there. Who was it? Anne, and some other. So this is like a challenge, right, in terms of what is the global international vision? I would include, because I come more out of a workers' right background, so we need a global minimum wage. We need a global set of worker labor standards. Those are already hard enough to win, much less a global basic income. That's ideal, right? It's like lovely to think about and imagine. So there's that. We have to do the visioning and imagining, right, around, I think, some global standards in addition to nation-state standards around economic citizenship. And then from there, we also have to do the strategizing. Like, we can barely win basic rights in this country, much less other places. How do we imagine winning on a global scale? It's really daunting, but it is, I think, our challenge collectively in this moment to be thinking about both the local, the national, and the international together. And how do we, this is John Powell from Berkeley's argument about othering and belonging. So how do we, everywhere in all three of those scales, right, local, national, global, how do we diminish the othering and enlarge in the sense of belonging in political communities, which is linked to a question of rights and citizenship and redistribution. So these are thorny, big problems that we need some collective help to solve. Like, not any one of us is going to come up with the right answer, but they should all be on the table, so thank you.
I'll take 2 more questions. In the back.
Oh, there you go. Ruben, Kide. So 2 questions and whatever you choose to engage. So what are effective strategies that you all have learned to cultivate unity, cohesion, collaboration amongst people and groups who have historically othered each other? And what's the role and balance of accountability versus forgiveness in that conversation? And the second thing is more personal question. What's the role of unlearning and healing and sustaining ourselves in this work?
I love that question. Can we hear from some Black people in this room? Any of y'all got some questions for us? Thank you.
Hi, my name is Junaid. So I'm interested in this tension between targeted programs and stigmatization, because, as I think Dorian noted, it seems obvious that the more a program is targeted, the more it's going to become stigmatized. We already know that a lot of poor Black people don't take up a lot of welfare programs because of the stigma attached to them. So I'm wondering how you're thinking about that tension between what is seemingly a misnomer, universalized, targeted universalization, and actually getting a program implemented. Because if we do a UBI Plus tomorrow, it doesn't seem as if the rest of society will think that's a great idea. And you risk the danger of communities of color being even more stigmatized than they are today because they're getting an additional benefit over and above the rest of society.
Thanks, Junaid. So, do you want to say anything in response to those questions?
One of the things that we know about how we address otherness is deeply, deeply personal, right? It is about building relationships with people. And that is not something that one does through policy change or political organizing. It's something that we do in the neighborhoods we live in the schools we go to, in our workplaces. It's a very local experience. And, it's one that can take a lifetime. But we also know that it's possible. We know that people who seem to exist in very, very different places and philosophically or in terms of what their values or priorities are, can find ways to connect with each other and build relationship and find things that are common among them. So I tend to think that that is what will actually save us all. I also think we don't have time for that. So the policy piece is really important. The political organizing is really important. to at least implement the changes that we want while we are doing the relationship building. But I do think that more of us actually need to take responsibility for figuring out how to build relationships. You know, forgiveness is tricky, I will say. I think that we know that kind of holding anger and resentment, whether it's, you know, because of issues like race and gender, or just like because your husband's being an asshole or whatever, like those things are not good for us, right? So we know that ultimately, like, paths toward forgiveness are healthy. And there are ways in which we expect people who have been harmed to forgive too quickly. And we lift up those stories as examples without kind of doing the work of repair and restoration that needs to come before forgiveness or alongside it. So I think that, yeah, generally, like, forgiveness is real good, but when we move to it too quickly, we actually don't, we just cover things up. We don't actually move toward building relationships and addressing harm.
Two very tough questions. I think I'll respond to the targeting question. So one way to think about it is we've done racially targeted policy in this country many, many times. It's just been targeted at benefiting white people. So my former colleague, Ira Katz-Nelson, wrote this book, When Affirmative Action Was White, of which Ta-Nehisi Coates based The Case for Reparations article off of. And it partly, you know, I think Ta-Nehisi says this, you only have to go to the 20th century. You don't have to go back to slavery. This 20th century, when you include the New Deal, our New Deal, which we all revere, lots of us, the GI Bill, federally backed housing mortgages, excluded black people. And therefore, were racially targeted at benefiting white people. So we've done racially targeted policy just in the other direction, right? So the question for us to grapple with, and it's a naughty question, is can we have an honest conversation about the racial harms and the racial benefits, because that racial targeting is invisible, because white people benefit it, so it's invisible to us. Can we think about the racial harms and what racial justice and equity will look like in this moment? And I think that all depends on which Dr. King we want to remember. Because as I mentioned before, the first half of that I Have a Dream speech, he's talking about the promissory note that America made to black people, and how when black folks go to cash the check on justice, right, he has this phrase about insufficient funds, and he starts to pivot by saying he refuses to believe the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. So if we want to remember that Dr. King and those values, then we should be pushing on that. If we want to remember a different Dr. King, then we shouldn't really talk about race and should water down, you know, content of character, blah, 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 great. But it depends on which Dr. King we actually really, truly are invested in honoring, and what legacy of his moral vision. This is related to the faith piece, in terms of the language and moral clarity of many faith traditions around justice. So which Dr. King do we want to honor? And which vision of the world that he proposed and many around him do we want to fight for? And so part of this is a question about who actually benefits from policies, and part of it's a framing question that involves political strategy, but also at the end of the day, our moral responsibility and the language of morality and justice. So you have to choose which angle you want to pursue. I'm fine. People want to pursue a more pragmatic strategy around, all right, you don't want to talk about race? I am. I will talk about it, and gender, and immigrant status, and a range of other things, because we have to, you know, the conversation has moved, at least among progressives, where now intersectionality is the common buzzword, to an extent that it wasn't even 5, much less 10 years ago. How do we take that to heart and make that real? What does an intersectional and transformative politics truly look like? And it's not just in the US, this is related to the previous question about the global problems and challenges that we're facing. So we have to grapple with this fundamental question of who belongs and who doesn't, and really figure out a range of strategies, whether it's political education. I think it's about power and organizing for power. I think people's attitudes catch up to their behaviors.
You know,
So anyway, it depends on which Dr. King we want to honor, and then we have to figure out a strategy and go out and fight for it.
I think I'm also not really worried about America resenting black people. Like, America already hates us. If they're gonna hate us, but like give us reparations too, like I would be happy to accept that. So, you know, I think, and I'm laughing, but I'm also serious. Like, there is, we have endured a lot. America hates black people. America hates poor people. The increased resentment, if it comes with a material benefit that's going to allow black folks and or poor folks to achieve some power and to achieve some self-determination, like, I'm okay with that. I don't think that that's the choice we actually need to face, but I'm just saying if I had to pick one or the other, like, I'd be cool with us getting the justice and the resentment, because we already have the resentment.
I think we have run out of time, so we are going to maybe take 2 more minutes just to listen to 2 questions here at the center, and then you won't get to respond. You'll just take them with you, and that will be so. Ansi, and then the other person with the mic. Yeah.
Hello. Okay, here's one just to think on, I guess. So, first of all, thank you both for coming. This has been incredible, so thank you so much. As someone who really supports UBI, one thing I think about, thinking about what it might lack is its ability to address wealth inequality, something that you guys have mentioned a couple of times, but you know, how it could potentially be used to, you know, increase home ownership that might begin to address that. But given the wealth inequality gap, and also recognizing that you can be behind more than one idea, I was wondering how you guys prioritize UBI compared to things like a social wealth fund where each citizen gets a share, or to employee stock ownership plans where low-income Americans can gain access to the wealth of small businesses. So yeah, just how you think about those different mechanisms.
And the last question? Yes.
Oops. Okay. Sorry. I think often in terms of UBI, at least the way that it's come into, that I've come to understand it, a lot of people appeal to the morality of universal basic income, but I think it was Assata Shakur who said, no, of course I'm paraphrasing, no one in history has ever gained their freedom by appealing to the morality of their oppressors. So outside of morality, of like this necessity for universal basic income, how do we get it? How do we get it? Because I feel like just appealing to the morality of politicians and people who already have wealth and people who are in power in spaces that they can make this happen, outside of, I guess, grassroots organization, I don't see it being something that it won't extend to their morality, or it's not something that they're going to think about.
Thank you so much, and I'm sorry to be doing this to you too, not being able to respond. Can you really stick to 30 seconds?
I'll stick 30 seconds. Just on that question, I think it's both and. The abolition movement was a moral movement, but an organized movement to build for power. The civil rights movement, all of our movements have been simultaneously about a moral vision for the good life and justice and democracy, but also strategic and pragmatic about building power to win the transformative changes that we need. So I actually think it's both and.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.